Hello there, everyone! If you're watching this video, then you are part of the TTOR army, an army that is building itself up one subscriber at a time. As you can see from the title and thumbnail of today's video, today we're going to be talking about an article put out on the A Register that is calling for censorship of open source projects on GitHub. The article in question, which you can see right here on the screen by the A Register, archived of course, is titled Arrogant, Subtle, Entitled, Toxic Open Source GitHub Discussions Examined. Developer interactions sometimes contain their own kind of poison. So in the first three paragraphs we read, toxic discussions on open source GitHub projects tend to involve entitlement, subtle insults, and arrogance, according to an academic study. That contrasts with the toxic behavior, typically bad language, hate speech, and harassment, found on other corners of the web. Whether that seems obvious or not, it's an interesting point to consider because, for one thing, it means technical and non-technical methods to detect and curb toxic behavior on one part of the internet may not therefore work well on GitHub. And if you're involved in communities on the code hosting giant, you may find this research useful in combating trolls and unacceptable conduct. It may also mean systems intended to automatically detect and report toxicity in open source projects, or at least the ones on GitHub, may need to be developed specifically for that task due to their unique nature. So according to the A Register, there's just all this toxic behavior happening on the discussion threads of various open source projects on GitHub, and we need to do something to moderate all that toxic behavior. But how often does toxic behavior actually occur? When we skip down into the article, we read the following. The open source community's long tradition of blunt interaction has led many projects to adopt codes of conduct, the paper notes. The reason for doing so is to encourage contributors to join open source projects and to keep them from being driven away by trolling and other forms of hostility. The researchers acknowledge that toxicity in open source is often written off as a naturally occurring, if not necessary, facet of open source culture. And while there are those who defend a more rough and tumble mode of online interaction, there are consequences for angry interactions. Witness the departures in the Perl community over hostility. Toxicity is different in open source communities, Miller said in a CMU news release. It is more contextual, entitled, subtle, and passive-aggressive. The Register asked Miller via email whether toxic as a term leaves room for individuals with different levels of tolerance for toxic behavior, given that labeling something toxic forecloses discussion about whether it's appropriate. When manually confirming that the comments were toxic, we considered a comment toxic if it could have made anyone want to leave the discussion, including a newcomer, Miller told us. This was intentionally done because, traditionally speaking, in many open source projects, toxicity is often dismissed as a naturally occurring and necessary aspect of the culture. However, many open source contributors have cited toxic and continuously negative behavior as their reason for disengaging. See Section 2 of our paper for more details. Because of this, it was important to consider toxicity that could be considered toxic to a wide spectrum of open source contributors. Toxicity in open source projects is relatively rare. The researchers in previous work found only about 6 per 1,000 GitHub issues to be toxic. That means a random sampling of issues wouldn't serve the research objective, so the group adopted several strategies for identifying toxic issues in comments. A language-based detector, finding mentions of codes of conduct, and locked threads and threads that had been deleted. The result was a dataset of 100 toxic issues on GitHub. What the researchers found was that toxicity on the Microsoft-owned website had its own particular characteristics. So according to this article, toxicity in open source project community threads is rare. Random samplings, legitimate research papers, found hardly any toxic discussions in comment sections on GitHub projects. But supposedly it's such a huge problem that we need to make a whole new way of moderating what people can talk about on the discussion threads of GitHub open source projects. And notice, too, how they admit that they couldn't find much toxicity, if any, in open source project community threads. So they basically had to jerry-rig their methodology in order to create toxic issues on GitHub. Well, we couldn't find any just by doing random samples and doing things the honest way, so we're going to jerry-rig it so that we can manufacture some toxicity on GitHub. And now we're going to read the conclusion of this article titled, "What's the Harm?" The paper explores the nature of toxicity on GitHub, but does not examine when real harm arises from it. The harms of toxicity were outside the scope of this project, but informally we observed that one thing that seemed to be an efficient way of curbing toxicity was for maintainers to cite their project's code of conduct and lock the thread as too heated, said Miller. This seemed to help reduce the amount of time and emotional labor involved if dealing with the toxicity. Asked about the findings, Martin Woodward, Senior Director of Developer Relations at GitHub, said in an emailed statement, "While it was reassuring to see that some of the more extreme toxic behaviors of online communities are less common on GitHub, the issues raised around people feeling entitled to put demands on the volunteer community leaders who run most open source projects is definitely something we recognize from our conversations with maintainers. We continue to try to educate people on GitHub with events like Maintainer Month, but we also continue to work with maintainers and researchers to improve the community moderation capabilities we provide." Miller said that while she and her colleagues had not spoken directly with GitHub about their findings, they do have ideas for mitigating hostile interactions. One recommendation is that since open source toxicity manifests differently than toxicity on other platforms, in order to effectively identify and intervene on it, future work should be build an open source specificity toxicity detector, said Miller. So to battle this non-existent problem of toxicity on GitHub projects, what we need to do is develop new moderation tools that allow us to censor the discussions that take place in threads on open source GitHub projects. This is the beginning of an effort by the establishment to start censoring open source projects. It will start with censoring the comments that occur on the pages of these projects on GitHub, to flat out saying that certain projects are not allowed to be shared on GitHub. GitHub, to my knowledge, is the most popular method of sharing open source projects with the world that the creators of open source projects have at their disposal. So if GitHub starts getting into the business of moderating the discussions that happen on the specific GitHub open source projects, and then they start censoring which projects are even allowed to be hosted on GitHub, well then we're going to need a GitHub alternative in the future. And that's something that if it already exists, I'm not aware of, and you can point it out to me in the comments section below. But if you are not aware of any such alternative to GitHub, we can talk about how best to make one. This particular censorship concerns me, this upcoming censorship of open source projects on GitHub. It concerns me because Creation Social, my open source alternative to Facebook and Gab, is built on an open source project called Open Source Social Network, which has its own GitHub page. And my own video sharing site, Corridor, as well as Seeking the Truth's video sharing site, Joshu TV, is run on the A Video project, which the script we use is from the A Video GitHub page. So GitHub is actually a pretty big player when it comes to hosting open source projects and allowing people to create their own open source projects as websites, whether that be social media sites or video sharing sites or whatever website you're talking about. We all use GitHub for our projects, so we do not like the idea of GitHub starting to censor the projects that they host on their site, whether that be censoring the comment sections and the discussion threads on these projects, or if they decide to, in the future, start censoring the projects themselves, saying, well, this project can be hosted on our site, but oh, you have the wrong beliefs and ideas, so you can't hold your open source project on our website. You're going to have to go somewhere else. We don't like that idea at all, and so we need to do everything in our power as alt tech people to combat any potential and future censorship on GitHub. and we need to fight against any censorship of open source projects.